Hello and welcome to each and every one of you. Lovely to see your faces in these Zoom boxes midday today. You have arrived at the third session of our Summer Fiction Book Club series. Today we are going to be engaging with The Ministry for the Future by New York Times bestselling author Kim Stanley Robinson. And what a piece of fiction, imagining so many storylines. My name is Nicole Dieroff, pronouns she, her. I serve as program director at the BTS Center, and I am glad to welcome you today. I am joined by seminarian Tyler Mark Nelson, who has been spending the summer working with the BTS Center, as well as our guest conversationalist, Derrick Weston. So glad to be with you today, Tyler and Derrick. The BTS Center is the organizational successor to Bangor Theological Seminary. We are located in Portland, Maine, on lands long stewarded by the Wabanaki, the people of the dawn. We seek to catalyze spiritual imagination with enduring wisdom for transformative faith leadership, and are focused on spiritual leadership for a climate-changed world. I'd like to extend a special welcome to all of you gathering live on Zoom today, as well as a warm welcome to all of you who may be watching the recording. We know that actually many people sign up in order to watch later, so hello to those of you who are doing that. At this point, I'd like to invite you to put on your digital name tag indicating how you would like to be known in this space, and open up the chat to say hello to your fellow Summer Fiction Book Club readers. And I'd invite you to start with, where are you logging in from today? Connecticut, a few Connecticut's, a few Maines, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Washington, Massachusetts. Just recovering from COVID, boo. Glad you're with us. Okay, next, let's unpack a couple of the storylines from this book, and there were so many. So first, I want to ask, was there a storyline in the Ministry for the Future which you found particularly upsetting or challenging? Go ahead and put that storyline in the chat. Thank you, Gail. Starts off with the heat. That's how the book starts, right? Yes, yes, yes. Dawn, when is violence acceptable? Yes. The wet bulb events. A kidnapping. Yes. Thank you, Jerry. The challenge of moving away from economic disparity. Thank you. I invite you to read what people are putting in here. Margaret, a quote, "It was as bad as it could get, and then it got worse." I know I experienced a few moments of feeling very upset about what I was reading, but I think in many ways, Kim Stanley Robinson was trying to write a book where things turn out okay, which is hard to find. So I am wondering if there is a storyline in the Ministry for the Future that you found particularly hopeful. Was there a piece of this book that you were really grateful to read, that you needed to read? Thanks, Deborah. The way solutions began popping up many places and coming together. Carolyn, global corporations compelled to see their own benefit in changing their ways. Scientific experiments. The hope in the friendship between the characters. India's transformation, thank you. If you're mid-typing, please finish your thought, and I invite you to continue to read what others are contributing here. I'm intrigued also whether it was easier to think of the storyline that was upsetting or easy to think of the storyline that was hopeful. I'm not sure which one was easier for you to come up with. All right, last but not least, my question is, how far have you gotten in reading The Ministry for the Future? Have you finished it? Have you almost finished? Are you hoping to read it this fall and you just want a little teaser today? And I invite you to put this in because I am hoping to put you in breakout rooms with people who, if you finish the book, they've also finished the book. If you're part way, they're also part way. So thank you again for showing up in this space, choosing to spend time on this particular day with this particular group of people discussing the ministry for the future. We know you have choices in how you spend your time, and we're so grateful to have you with us. Tyler.
Thanks, Nicole, and welcome bibliophiles and bookworms to the Summer Fiction Book Club. My name is Tyler Mark Nelson. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm a summer program consultant at the BTS Center and a third-year seminarian at Yale Divinity School. As we begin our time together, I encourage you to find a comfortable position, perhaps light a candle or open the window to catch a breeze, or grab a favorite drink, whatever feels book clubbish to you. For myself, I've got a mug of piping hot black coffee, which will surely get me through this morning. The Summer Fiction Book Club arose out of our belief that good stories reveal present realities and they imagine possible futures. Fiction can serve as a window through which we come upon compelling and creative visions of social, ecological, political, and economic possibilities. Through a good story, voices of the marginalized, the silenced, the forgotten speak their truth to power. They also give witness to the global experiences shared by human and other than human communities most affected by climate change. Because we live in a time of profound spiritual and ecological crisis, the multi-species world needs spiritual practitioners and leaders, and in this case, readers, who understand that just transformation is possible when better stories are told and received and embodied. As Nicole shared, this month we have been reading a boldly imaginative book called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, who is an American science fiction author. His book combines elements of environmental horror, utopian visions, eco-terrorism, cutthroat geopolitics, economic analysis, ecological education, critiques of Western colonialism and neoliberal neocolonialism, plus so much more. Robinson imagines what would happen if a governmental entity was tasked with a mission of advocating for the rights of future generations, all while dealing with the real-world trajectory of climate change and disruption. So before we begin, here's a quick overview of our gathering today. In the first segment, we will hear from our guest conversationalist, Derrick Weston, about the insights and impacts of the Ministry for the Future. Then we will put you into breakout groups and provide discussion prompts to guide your small group. And after breakouts, we will once again return to the full group where you will have a good opportunity to ask Derrick your questions about the book, about his work, and his impression on it. With that said, I am so excited to introduce our guest conversationalist, Derrick Weston. Derrick is a writer, a filmmaker, podcaster, a speaker, and educator whose most recent work has focused on the intersection of food and faith. He is the co-host of the Food and Faith podcast and producer of Spoon, Spade, and Soul, a podcast highlighting food and land-based ministries in the Episcopal Church. Derrick works with one of our friend organizations, Creation Justice Ministries, where he is the theological education and training coordinator. He received his bachelor's in film studies from the University of Pittsburgh, his master's of divinity from San Francisco Theological Seminary, and he also has certification in health ministry from Wesleyan Theological Seminary and was a part of the Regenerate Fellowship on Food, Faith, and Ecology through Wake Forest Divinity School. There is, I'm sure, so much more to say about Derrick and his work, but let's hear from Derrick himself. Welcome.
Thank you. So good to be here with all of you.
So glad to have you. Well, let's jump right into the book. I'm curious if there is a certain passage or a quote or even just a chapter, because they're so short sometimes, that made a strong impression on you.
Yeah, I was telling Tyler and Nicole before we started that I was having a hard time narrowing down to one passage. And so I will, because so many of you, there are enough of you who have not finished the book, I will flag a couple things. Chapter 80 is probably my favorite. It's about regenerative agriculture and old practices becoming sort of trendy. And chapter 90, I think, is the funniest chapter. But what I'm going to read very quickly is from chapter 32. And it's talking about so many of the economics pieces I kind of glazed over, not my expertise. But I thought this was, I thought this part was really great. It was talking about a discount rate. And basically, the lower the discount rate, the better it was for future generations. And so I just want to read, this conversation is between Mary and Dick. And as they talk about the discount rate, Dick says, yes, it's a number put on an ethical decision. Mary, a number which can't be justified on its merits. Dick, right. This often gets admitted. No one denies future people are going to be just as real as us, so there isn't any moral justifications for the discounting. It's just for our own convenience. Plenty of economists acknowledge this. Robert Solos said we ought to act as if the discount rate were zero. Roy Heron said the discount rate was a polite expression for rapacity. Frank Ramsey said called it ethically indefensible. He said it came about because of a weakness of the imagination. Mary, but we do it anyway. Dick, we kick their ass. Mary, easy to do when they're not here to defend themselves. Dick, true. I like to think of it as a rugby match with present-day people as the New Zealand All Blacks playing against a team of 3-year-olds who represent the people of the future. We kick their ass. It's one of the few games we're good at winning. Mary, I can't believe it. Dick, yes, you can. Mary, but what do we do? Dick, we're the ministry for the future. So we step in and we play for the 3-year-olds. We substitute for them. Mary, we play rugby against the All Blacks. Dick, yes, they're pretty good. Mary, so they'll kick our asses too. Dick, unless we get as good as they are. Mary, but can we do that? Dick, we may be sticking with this analogy a little too far here, but let's do that for the fun of it. So now I'm thinking about that movie about the South African football team when the World Cup was held in South Africa. They were a beginner team, but they ended up winning it all. Mary, how did they do that? Dick, you should watch the movie. Basically, they were playing for more than the game. The other teams were playing because that's what they did. It was their profession. But those South Africans, they were playing for Mandela. They were playing for their lives. So I'll stop right there. It's a great passage. I think recognizing, one, it kind of put economics into a term that was into a way that was a little bit more easy to understand, and particularly economics for the future, that the idea was that someone had to start playing on the side of future generations. And that to win, when team that is being played against required that we were playing for something more. And it's one of the themes that I think continues to come up throughout the book, that if we just lean into our own self-interest, we're never going to make the kinds of changes that need to be made. So there has to be larger guiding principles to get us to the places where we need to go.
The conversations, the back and forths here, especially when I find Mary is involved. I appreciate Mary because she asked the questions that I'm wondering, like, what does that mean? Speak more of economics. And I think this is such a great passage you highlighted on ways that I think critique and also imagine what economics could be in this time. And the values that are outside of economics, but which economics needs in order to do well. There's another passage I would like to read for you. It's page 349. I mean, there's so much to cover in these nearly 600 pages. But this passage, I think, really hits at many themes in the book, as well as many of the conversations we have around BTS Center and our friend organizations. So page 349, where the narrator speaks about the wet bulb 38 in the American South that killed over 300,000 people. The narrator says, "Not as large as the great Indian heat wave had been, but this time it was Americans in America. The fact made a difference, especially to Americans. Although still, in the months that followed, people's biases emerged. It was the South where it happened. It was mostly poor people, in particular, poor people of color. It couldn't happen in the North. It couldn't happen to prosperous white people. This was yet another manifestation of racism and contempt for the South, yes, but also a universal cognitive disability in that people had a very hard time imagining that catastrophe could happen to them until it did." There's a whole lot moving about in this passage, Derrick, and I'm wondering if you could pull at a couple threads within that and unpack it for us.
Yeah, like you said, there's a lot going on here. One of the things that I will say that maybe is my favorite aspect of this book is that the Americans don't save the day. And in fact, throughout the book, the Americans are the problem, and continually highlighted as the problem. And it's other nations of the world that really lead the efforts that make that get to the end of the book. I think what's important about this is what we know is that the most vulnerable populations in the world are the ones who are going to be first affected by climate change. And that's true globally, and it's true in our country as well. And what's interesting in this book, and particularly in this passage, is this isn't the first time that there's a horrific event that happens in the United States. The first one happens, and it was actually incredibly eerie. It was in Southern California, and I was actually reading that passage as Hurricane Hillary was hitting, and it was really disturbing. But as they talk in the book, you know, there's a perception that Southern California isn't America. And then as we get into this part of it, that it's okay for certain parts of America to struggle, and there are acceptable damages, that America doesn't actually turn and change because the South is damaged, because 300,000 people in the South were killed. America, and even, you know, I think about this, think about this in terms of 9/11, right? We made significant social changes in this country because New York City and Washington, D.C. were attacked. And someone put in the chat, think about Hurricane Katrina and the social changes that were made in comparison, uh, they're night and day. We really made no significant social changes in light of Katrina. So we have, I think this speaks a lot to the United States, the fact that we don't have a unifying narrative of what it means to be American. And that is one of our ongoing and continual challenges. But throughout this book, there are different conversations happening between the white European and American countries and the white parts of mixed race countries and the countries of the global majority. And the countries of the global majority and the people of the global majority are stepping up in different ways. They're making different decisions. And again, I don't want to ruin the book for anyone, but even at the end, as we get to sort of a conclusion, there is still a sense of we have immigrants in the European parts of the world, and they're not completely integrated into the society. And there's still going to be struggles for them moving forward that might not be experienced by the rich majorities in the world. So I just think it's humbling, it's sobering, feels very real, that this part of the book highlights these disparities.
Right. Thank you for naming so many of those things. I was watching the chat as you were speaking, and Nicole brought up the idea of collateral damage, which Robin Walt Kimmerer mentions. I think of, in economic terms, externalized costs, which is so much of, we could look at fashion or industry or emissions, which United States, since we're on that topic, externalizes the costs, externalizes the whether financial or physical pains of that. And we see in this passage that even within the nation, there is a sort of externalizing of what hurts enough to act and what doesn't hurt enough for those who could take action. So, Derrick, thanks for these initial thoughts as we're jumping into the book. You've given us many things to consider as we now transition into small group discussion. So as Nicole is preparing these groups of four or so people, she'll place a few prompts in the chat that are meant as inspiration for your conversation. But we do welcome that you just go with the flow of your group. So as you enter your breakout group, briefly introduce yourselves and then jump into those questions.
Okay, I just popped in an invitation to introduce and some key questions. And let me pop in a couple of these additional questions Tyler has crafted for us. Okay, when you see an invitation to join a small group, I invite you to click yes. Tyler, remind us, you may have already said it. When are we coming back?
Oh, thank you. So we'll come back at 11:50. So you'll have about 25 minutes in your groups.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Just started up the recording again. So hello to anyone watching asynchronously after the fact, and everybody else will be zooming in a few seconds.
I accidentally let myself
Came early.
came back. I didn't mean to.
That happens. You're not the first.
Welcome back. I think we have most everyone here slowly returning. Well, I hope you had a great time with your breakout session. I see a lot of head nodding. Looks like it must have been. At this time, we are going to enter into a moment of Q&A with our guest conversationalist, Derrick Weston. And I want to give you about 2 minutes of quiet to come up with your own questions for him And then you can enter those into the chat. But I want to give you, time of reflection just to see what is churning in this moment. Okay. I see many moving arms, which I imagine means keyboards are clicking. But as we jump in, I've got a question for you, Derrick. So this book poses all sorts of challenging questions about violence. There's the violence of the children of Kali, the violence of nation states through their policies, violence of the capitalist market and corporations who choose short-term profit over long-term life, secret violence even of the Ministry for the Future, violence of extreme weather events, and so on. So coming from a place of faith yourself, how do you think about political violence in the face of death-dealing realities?
Yeah, that's such a tough question. So a couple of things. One, I think that we as people of faith have to have a unified voice condemning violence and condemning all the forms of violence, condemning all the ways that violence shows up in our culture, whether that's blatant, whether that's through systems, whether that's through policy. And alongside that condemnation needs to come the expectation of violence and the preparedness to mobilize when violence happens. I think one of the things that happens for us when violence happens is we condemn, and then we feel outrage, and then we hand wring and navel gaze. And I think part of what we have to, I think, particularly moving forward, we're going to have to accept that there's going to be incidences of violence, and we have to be prepared to mobilize after them. So much of the progress that was made in the book wasn't so much about returning violence for violence. It was about capitalizing off of moments where the violence occurred and holding up the violence as wrong, but using the energy that the violence created to mobilize people to act for something better. And I think that's where we as people of faith need to stand, in the space of saying violence is not the answer. Violence is always wrong, and it's always breaking the heart of God. And violence is sort of a constant in our world, and we need to be ready to respond in ways that are strategic and yet compassionate and just. Easier said than done. That's and easier and in a culture that often confuses violence with justice, really hard to make those differentiations of what a really just response looks like. But we have to be attuned to when those moments of violence happen, that there's going to be energy created, and that energy can either turn into more violence, or it can turn into compassionate solutions.
So good. What you had me thinking of there, as you're mentioning, preparing to mobilize for when violence happens. Unfortunately, violence will happen. And so there's there's almost a foreknowledge that, well, we can be ready for it. We can step in, and there's a choice at that moment of violence. And you mentioned Hurricane Katrina earlier. When Katrina happened, there was a decision for action, either compassion or more violence. And we saw the more violent side when different corporate interests moved into the South, moved into Louisiana, and almost did it's what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism. Wait for disaster and violence, and then opportunize that. But then we also saw folks coming in with supplies and water and rebuilding and that compassion response. So can you think of what maybe one thing that folks here today could do to prepare for upcoming moments of violence or disaster?
Great question. I think that we, and again, I think there's a difference between there is a difference between the violence that we experience from the hands of others and the violence that we experience from natural disaster, and the violence that we experience from systems. But the one unifying thing I think that we can say in all of them as people of faith is to say it's not God's will. That the devastation of life is never God's will. So I think being able to say that, and being able to say that clearly, not being able to not describe, well, as the history of faith traditions has sometimes been to say, well, there was a purpose in all of this. No, there's damage, and there's space for us to, and I would say one of the things that the church is uniquely positioned to do is to step alongside those who are grieving, and to be in the spaces where people are grieving, and to recognize that there is a space for lament. There's a space to grieve, and that space of lamentation actually is where a lot of the energy for change comes from. And a lot of times we don't have the energy for change because we haven't done the work of grief. We haven't done the work of grieving. We haven't done the work of lamentation. And so being in those spaces and helping people to grieve and not rush through their grief, not rush through the pain of the violence that they're experiencing, is actually a great place for communities of faith and people of faith to show up, to not sweep people's pain under the rug, to in some ways lift it up in a space where it can be felt communally and felt empathetically. Because that's where that energy comes to the surface that can then mobilize for places of action.
Absolutely. That line you said, that we often don't have the energy to act because we haven't yet lamented, we haven't yet grieved and experienced the not just the emotion or affect of violence, but the very reality of violence itself, and us being in relation to that, whether on front lines or whether being complicit in violent economic systems. And then for the communities of faith to hold this space for processing, for feeling, for, I think of grief and sorrow as like the check engine light on a vehicle. And if we just keep driving our electric vehicle, of course, if we keep driving and we're seeing, this check battery, we're about to combust, and we just keep going, something's wrong. We've got to pull over. We've got to do some inner maintenance on that before we can continue on our path.
Well said.
Thank you. I just borrowed what you already said. So another question here is actually one that was posed to our breakout groups, and there's been a lot of good talk around it. So I want to bring it to you here. So this quote that has gone around for a couple decades from Frederick Jameson, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. Jameson was actually Robinson's doctoral supervisor, so pulling in some eco-Marxist thought, or at least engaging in those dialogues. And Robinson gives so much attention to economics, to policy, to technocratic innovation, and yet is so scathing on neoliberal capitalism and the systems that are continuing to mutate today. So how does reading this book influence your own understanding of the climate change, capitalism, neoliberalism, and how might we also extend that critique without completely abandoning everything? Or should we?
Yeah. It's such a, in some ways, capitalism is the elephant in the room, right? When we are having these conversations, that there's capitalism, it's hard to imagine the end of it because there's not the desire. Because at some point, the part of the imagination of the American dream is that at some point, capitalism is going to work itself out for me, and that is the myth that we've all kind of bought into, that one day capitalism is going to work itself out for me, and that very individualistic, that very tribal understanding is what perpetuates capitalism. The understanding that what works for me might not work for my neighbor is really the piece that we have to grow to understand. And I love that there's a return to the refrain from Aldo Leopold, that what's good is what's good for the land. That is a really hard concept for people to wrap their heads around, because what we've accepted as good is what's good for me, and mine. So I think that there are people, where I actually find hope is that I think there are people who are beginning to see the cracks in capitalism. They're beginning to see that income inequality has become so extreme, has become so ridiculous. When we have people who are using their wealth to go to Mars, that like we really have gotten to a place of ridiculousness. And people are starting to think about expressions of mutual aid, and people are starting to think about systems of bartering, and people are starting to think about systems that kind of are off the radar in terms of how to meet the needs of themselves and of their communities. And I see a lot of this in the work that I do, in the ways that a lot of community gardens and community farms operate. New systems are beginning to arise, and they're going to come from the cracks of the empire. They're not going to come from the top down. They're going to come from the bottom up, and we have to be looking for them, and we have to figure out ways to participate with them.
Thank you for that one. From the cracks of the empire, something new will emerge. That had me thinking of our we did a Bible study called Lectio Terra within our BTS staff, and we focused on a passage in Proverbs 30, which speaks of the ants who, though they have no king, they still organize and work together. And it had me thinking, the most humble creatures are able to build, they're able to terraform essentially entire hillsides. And so what would it mean for humans across faiths, across social locations, across the globe to organize from the humble, from the ground up, rather than expecting from above to change anything?
Yeah.
Another question here. This is from Catherine. I'm imagining this is from the book. Which partial solutions do you feel are the most realistic? And which do you feel are the most unrealistic for implementation? And maybe we could do one of each, one that you think's most realistic and one you feel is unrealistic.
Hey, Tyler and
Yeah.
Derrick, I'm wondering
Yes.
if we actually want to invite people to respond to that question in the chat too, because I'd kind of be interested both in Derrick's
Yeah.
thoughts and other people. So if you feel so inspired and want to pop in the chat, like realistic or unrealistic, I think I'm interested.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great idea.
Yeah. Um, I will I'll actually start with the unrealistic. I think, and it's sort of the driver for really the second half of the book, and it's the idea of carbon coin. The idea that there would be a new monetary system that everyone would buy into and that people would be incentivized. In some ways, it feels like the thing that would actually have to happen for this, and maybe that's why it feels the most unrealistic. That we would completely change our monetary system um, feels pretty unrealistic right now. And maybe we would take the kind of crises point that we see in the book. But as someone mentioned, I think the most realistic, and I think one of the most hopeful things that I see, again in my work, is regenerative agriculture. That it's happening, and that it's currently sequestering carbon as we speak, and that there are people who are currently doing that work. And by the way, it connects us to the oldest forms of agriculture. It's not new invention. It's not innovation. It is something that has been around since people put seeds in the dirt. And we learned that we were part of an ecosystem, and we learned that we were part of the natural cycles, and that those things, that when we actually contribute to the way that the natural ecosystem works, waste is not produced because the natural cycle doesn't produce waste. So and again, that's why chapter 80 is my favorite. It's also the wonderful back and forth between the husband and wife that happens in chapter 80, which is lovely. Um, but it really is about the fact that these um, we're discovering old ways of doing things. We're discovering kind of ancient ways of doing things and recognizing that newer isn't always better. That there is wisdom from the ages that can be brought back into our current way of doing things. Um, and agriculture is it's the place I'm most informed about. But I think that there are these ancient ways of doing things in lots of places in our culture that we can point to, um, where we're seeing that innovation isn't always the answer, but actually return is the answer.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Returning to ancient wisdom and learning from those who today are continuing to practice that themselves. What came to mind was this idea of cosmic compost. You don't create something new. Everything is coming from past lives and whatnot. So being a filmmaker, podcaster, storytelling is what you do across many mediums. So as a final question today, what is your elevator speech, 30-second, 45-second elevator speech for why reading fiction matters in these times? Or storytelling, let's say that.
Yeah. Story changes hearts and minds. Throughout the scripture, we see Jesus being asked a question and he responds with story. Story is what changes people. Story is what connects people's theoretical inward life to outward realities. And whether or not we are conscious of it or not, the way we live our lives is because of a story we believe. A story we believe about the world, a story we believe about ourselves. And so in order for us to have a better world, we have to have better stories.
That is the elevator speech for the Summer Fiction Book Club. Thank you so much, Derrick Weston, for this conversation today, for being our guest conversationalist, engaging these really rich questions from our participants in the chats. Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson was a tough read, but you made it so easy to speak about. So thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Right. And much gratitude to each of you who joined for today's book gathering and also the July and June gatherings. Our 3 book selections were imaginative, heart-wrenching, hopeful, challenging, and my hope is that you will continue to explore the themes and questions that we worked through and encountered this summer. And now with some closing remarks, Nicole.
Thank you, Tyler, and thank you, Derrick. First, just the invitation, if anyone wants to wave some thanks or put up a reaction on your Zoom screen with thanks for this conversation, you're welcome to do that. Tyler, I'm so grateful for your leadership with this inaugural BTS Center Summer Fiction Book Club. We do intend to engage another 3 books of fiction next summer. And anyone who's here, we'd welcome your feedback on this season of Summer Fiction Book Club and any book ideas that you would want us to pick up next. So I'm popping my email address and Tyler's email address into the chat. Feel free to write us. We had someone in the chat request book ideas, and we did collect several in preparing for this summer. So we'll be eager and happy to share those around with you. So you have reading for a full year, even if we're not getting together to discuss them. Also coming soon, Tyler has been working on discussion guides for each of the 3 books we engage this summer. So we hope maybe some of you want to bring the Ministry for the Future, How Beautiful We Were, or People of the Whale to your neighborhood book club or your congregation or community. And we hope that these discussion guides will make that extra doable. And last but not least, I want to share that the big event coming up for the BTS Center is Convocation, our annual legacy event. This year, we are focusing on kinship, reweaving the great web of belonging with keynote speakers Victoria Lours and John Bear Mitchell, along with creative and contemplative immersions, Lectio Terra Bible study and affinity groups, and lots more good stuff. So I hope you might consider joining us in person in Hallowell, Maine, or as an online companion. The online companionship track is going to go live super soon, and we invite any of you who are less local geographically to be a part of this with us. You can learn more and register at what's being popped in the chat by Tyler and Alan. Thank you. So now, Tyler, Derrick, and I, we hope that you might go into this day as inspired fiction readers who care deeply about the climate, this planet, and humanity. Blessings, friends. Have a good Thursday.